Hello, this is Amin, and you are watching session 46 of ASP.NET Core and MVC tutorial. In this session, we are going to work with SQL Server and MySQL and connect SQL Server and MySQL with Entity Framework Core. Also, we will talk about Entity Framework Core database migration. When we want to use SQL Server database as a database of a web application, we should configure our startup class and we should connect the DBContext class to the database that we want to use. When we install Visual Studio, it's automatically installed the instance of SQL Server, which is local DB, and we are going to connect our entity framework core with the local DB, and also we will show you how you can connect your DbContext class with SQL Server, which is the independent instance of SQL Server. Also, in this session, we will show you how you can connect your web application with MySQL database, and also can practice and connect your web application with any database engine that you want. Let me flip to Visual Studio and first connect my entity framework core and my web application with the local DB Server, which is a built-in instance of SQL Server. And as I mentioned, when we install this Visual Studio, this instance of SQL Server is installed automatically. This is the project that we have been working so far throughout this tutorial, and as you can see, I have created DbContext class for my web application. And in this session, I'm going to connect this DbContext class with the database engine that I want. And first, I'm going to connect this one with the local SQL Server that I have. First, let me add a Server Explorer. For this purpose, I'm going to View and click here on Server Explorer. Also, I need the SQL Server Object Explorer, and for this purpose, I can go again to View and add SQL Server Object Explorer. And here you can see I have local DB, and inside the local DB, I don't have any database yet, as I haven't created and migrated any database here. For connecting this DbContext to the database engine, first I need go to a startup. And for have access to appsettings.json content that I will describe later, I need a constructor inside the startup and IConfiguration interface. That's why I add a constructor. And then, as I mentioned, I need an instance of IConfiguration interface, and with pressing Control period key, I can add the read-only variable an instance of this interface. And through this interface, I would have access to the content of appsetting.json that I will store the connection string there. Then I need to have connection between the database engine and my web application and the DbContext inside my web application. For this purpose, I'm going to configure services method, and I use services. Then I use add DbContext. You can see I have two add DbContext, one add DbContext and another one is add DbContext pool. The concept of both somehow are the same, but performance-wise, add DbContext pool is better because it has a pool of connection, and sometimes I can use the instance of that connection. That's why I'm using add DbContext pool. Then I need to add the DbContext that I created in previous session here. For this purpose, I copy the name of DbContext, which is web app DbContext, and I paste it here, and then open and close parentheses. And inside this one, I can use this option, which is DBContext option, to connect the web application and entity framework core of this web application to the database that I want. I use Lambda expression, and through this Lambda expression, I can connect my web application to the database engine. I use DBContext option, and then I select use SQL Server method. Then I should mention the connection string of the server inside this method. But here, as its namespace is not available, I can add the namespace here, which is inside using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And when I add the required namespace, I can use this method to connect this web application to the SQL Server. And here I can mention the connection string, but I don't want to write the connection string inside the startup class. That's why I'm going to appsettings.json and create my connection string inside the appsettings.json file. Then through the constructor that I created and the instance of IConfiguration, I would have access to app setting, and I can read the connection string from that file. Let me go to appsettings.json, and here I will add my connection string. And inside the connection string, I mentioned a name for my connection string. I use custdb connection SQL local for this connection string, and then I use server for name of the server that I want to connect with. And the server is localDB MS SQL localDB. As you can see inside SQL Server Object Explorer, I have localDB MS SQL localDB. And inside that one, I don't have any database yet. And also I need the name of database, and I set name of database to custdb. And also, as I want to use Windows authentication to authenticate with this instance of SQL Server, I should use a trusted connection and make it to true. By default, its option is false. And if trusted connection would be false, I should add the username and password. But as I don't want to use username and password of the SQL Server instance, I use trust connection and make it to true. And then I use this connection string to connect my web application with the local DB SQL server, and I copy this name and use it in the startup class. And then here through IConfiguration interface, I will have access to appsettings.json. I use the instance of IConfiguration interface, which is configuration. And then I will use a get connection string method. And then here I use the name of connection string that I have, and I copy the name of connection string from here and then paste it here. Next step, I need to add some property to DbContext class that I created in previous session, and create a property of DbSet for each model that I have. Here I should add the models and the domain classes that I have as an entity of this web application to create a respective table for that one inside the database that I have. In this session, I just use category, which I created in previous sessions, and I create just category entity as a database. But in upcoming session, I will talk about the rest of models and And domain classes same as cost and payment method and the rest of the entity that I need inside my web application. But here I add a property, and its type should be DbSet, and I use category as a DbSet, and its name should be categories, or any name that you want, but it should be a meaningful, and it should have related with the model that I have. Now I set the DbSet inside the DBContext class, and now I want to use Entity Framework Core migration to migrate this database and this entity to the database that I want. And for this purpose, I can use a package manager console. And if you don't have package manager console, you can go to view other windows, package manager console from this path. And when you click on this one, you will have package manager console here. And also, same as the command line, you can use get help to receive a guideline of this package manager console. I'm not going to detail of package manager console, and I'm going to database migration to migrate these domain classes to the database that I called here. And as long as the migration would be done, and when I run the required command, I would have costdb here inside localDB MySQL localDB. And as you can see, I don't have this database right now, but after migration, I would have the database here. But before database migration, I will check the domain classes that I have, category. And here I want to make ID as a key. That's one I can use key data annotation. Also, I don't need this one here, and I remove it. And also I don't need the regular expression here, and I save the changes. And then I'm going to package manager console to migrate this domain class to the database. For this purpose, I can use add migrate command, but when I mention the part of the command and I press tab key, the command would be completed, and I should add a name. And as it is the initialization of this database, I use initDB as abbreviation of initialization DB. If I haven't mentioned this name here and I run the command, I receive a prompt that I should mention a name for this migration. Let me run this command and see the result and what would be changed in my project. Project built successfully, and you can see I have automatically the migrations folder, and inside the migration folders I have two classes which contain the changes that I want to implement inside the database. And it's look like a query string, and the query which create a table with the property that I want. As you can see, the name of property is the same as name of property here inside the category model. And also you can see the primary key would be ID, and also all the requirements which I implement in the category model with data annotation applied inside this class, and it would be reflected in the table of database costdb. But as you can see here, to undo these changes, I can use remove migration, and for going a step back, I can use remove migration command. And you can see the command is launched successfully, and the migration folder is removed completely, because this is the initialization database migration, and when I remove that one, all the folder automatically removed. But let me add the migration again. And this time I don't mention any name, and you can see I received the prompt, and I use initdb for initialization the database. And you can see again the migrations folder is created, and the class which is related to the changes that I want to implement inside the database is created inside the migrations folder. And next step, I want to implement these changes inside the database that I selected through the connection string. For this purpose, I can use database update command inside the package manager console. I use update database, and by launching this command, you can see inside the SQL Server Object Explorer, when I refresh this one, you can see inside the database, I have a CastDB database, and inside that one, I have a table, which is categories table. And you can see I have the property that I have inside the category model here. And you can see the changes that I want and the setting that I implemented through data annotation implemented inside this database as well. And next, I want to connect Entity Framework Core and DBContext with the another instance of SQL Server, which is the SQL Server that I have installed in my PC. For this purpose, just I need to change the connection string, and then change the connection string inside the startup class. Let's implement the changes that I want. I'm going to appsettings.json file and add another connection string. This time I call it CastDB connection SQL Server. And again, I should connect it to server. And as it is installed inside the current machine, I can use dot as a server address, and then database name should be CastDB again. And this time I'm using username password, and I don't want to use Windows authentication. That's why I use username and password to connect to the instance of SQL Server that I have installed inside my computer. I use the username and password that I want. Also, for preventing to store the sensitive data, same as the credential of SQL Server instance or any critical information, and stop sending this critical data to any open instance, I can use persist security info, and I should set it to false for security purposes. If I haven't set it, it's automatically true, and the credential and other critical data would be stored inside the Windows and will be available inside any open connection. That's why I use persist security info and I set it to false. Next, I use this connection string to a startup class, and just I change it. You can see I can easily switch between the databases, and I can implement my database inside the different databases. Again, I just update the database. And this time I'm going to Server Explorer and create one new connection. And I change it to Microsoft SQL Server. As it is inside my computer, I can use that for reaching this one. And here I can use SQL Server authentication, and you can see I can use the credential that I stored inside the connection string. And here you can see I have custDB, which is created by update database command. And I check the connection, and I will add this connection. And here you can see I have table category, same as the time that I implement this database with the local instance of SQL Server. Next, I want to connect this entity framework to MySQL instead of SQL Server. For this purpose, I need to install a proper provider to connect this entity framework to MySQL instead of SQL Server. But before going further, for launching this type of command, you have to install the package which is related to entity framework core tools. If you remember, in the previous session I have installed the required packages, and here inside the NuGet Packages you can see I have installed Microsoft.entity framework core.tools, which is the required package for launching add migration, drop database, or the rest of command that you can see I use for database migration with Entity Framework Core. But now I need to set up proper provider to connect my Entity Framework Core to MySQL. Let me check the provider list, which I provided its link in the previous session. And here you can see list of provider, and as I want to connect my entity framework core and my DBContext to MySQL database engine, I can use this NuGet package. I'm copying this NuGet package name, which is a provider, and I'm going to install that one. I'm going to browse and paste its name here, and you can see its package is available, and I select the version which is compatible with my web application, and I'm going to install it. And then here I should accept the licenses, and you can see I installed the package here, and I have MySQL.entity framework core here. Now I'm going to connect my web application to MySQL this time. For this purpose, first I'm going to appsettings.json and create another connection string to connect Entity Framework Core with the MySQL. This time I use DBConnection MySQL, and the server name it would be localhost, and name of database would be custDB, and the user would be root, and the password would be null. And also I use persist security info, as I have some critical data inside my connection string, and I set it to false. Next, I'm going to a startup class, and this time here I should use a DB options file, and this time instead of use SQL Server I should use use MySQL instead of use SQL Server. And then I use the connection string that I set for this purpose, and I paste it here, and I save the changes. Then I'm going to Package Manager, and again I update the database. I have some error inside the connection string. Let me check my connection string to find the errors. And as you can see, I should use equal here instead of double quotation. And again, I save the project and update the database. And another error in this part, I wrote false with typo. I save it, and again I update my database. As you can see, my version of migration is not compatible with my MySQL. That's why I remove this version of migration, and then I'm going to category and remove the part which is not compatible with MySQL. And again, I save the project and use add migration and name it init db MySQL. You can see the new version of migration is created, and then I update the database. And this time you can see when I change the category model and I remove the part which is not compatible with MySQL, the database is created inside the MySQL. Let's check with Server Explorer and create another connection. And this time I'm using MySQL database. It is inside localhost, and its user is root and the password is none. And you can see I have CastDB inside the SQL Server. And inside that one, you can see I have category tables. And the category table has the property and the field that I have inside my model. And in the continuation of this series, I will use SQL Server as a database, and I'm going to implement my project and use SQL Server Engine as a database engine. But I want to show you in this session how you can connect your entity framework core and your web application with different database engine. Let's recap this session. First, I created a constructor for a startup class, and I create an instance of IConfiguration interface to have access to appsettings.json. Then I create a connection string inside appsettings.json. I use a tree connection string for using the instance of SQL Server which installed automatically with Visual Studio, and then I use another connection string to connect my entity framework core and my context and my DbContext class to SQL Server, and then I use another connection string to connect my web application to MySQL Server. Then I set the setting inside the startup class. I use services and add DBContext pool, and I use the name of web app DbContext, which the classes that I created for DBContext of this web application. Then through the DBContext options ability, I connect my domain classes to the database, and I create a database and table with the domain classes that I have. You can see here it is the connection string which is related to SQL Server. And here you can see the connection string which I used for connecting my database to MySQL. And also here you can see I use trusted connection to use the Windows authentication to authenticate with the SQL Server. And also I use persist security info and I set it to false to prevent passing the sensitive data through the open connection. And as you can see, when persist security info is set to false, security sensitive information such as password is not returned as a part of the connection if the connection is open or has ever been in an open state. If you set persist security info to true, Windows will remember the password specified in the connection string. And then I set a property and DbSet inside the DbContext class that I created. In this session, I just use the category model, and in the upcoming session, I will use the rest of the model that I have. Also, I use add migration, remove migration, and update database to migrate my database. And as you can see, migration is a way to keep the database schema in sync with the entity framework core model by preserving data. Thank you for watching this session. Don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel and follow us on our social media channels. Once more, thank you for being with us.